Hello, everybody, and welcome to my little spiel on action research and kind of providing a guide for you on what that looks like. I'm going to keep it in my view, my preview mode with my notes, just so I don't go too far off topic. All right, so I'm borrowing a little bit of the framework from Andrew Johnson's textbook, and it's chapter 3. There you are. Okay, so using action research to solve problems. So what we're talking about is basically identifying a problem for your practicum, for your research study, because what you're going to do really is kind of like a mini action research related to your classroom, your school, or a data set that currently exists in your particular venue. So if you happen to fall outside of education, we can work with that too. We just have to talk about what the setup and what the focus is actually going to be. Because it is a practicum, you're supposed to be putting something into practice. In this case, it's focusing on educational issues or literacy issues, etc., related to what you do. So that's the idea, and we're going to do that through trying to create some kind of fix in action research. So first we need to identify a certain problem. So whatever problem is that, or belief, like I have in the syllabus, about what a possible problem could be at your school or in your venue or in your classroom. So we define the problem to try to seek to understand the nature of what's going on. So what's the cause and effect? What are we missing that could make something better? What are we doing that's crashing and burning at the moment and making it better? How do we make it better? So it's kind of like a continuous improvement. I know we throw that out in schools a lot, but this is actually a mechanism for continuous improvement. It's not of, you failed this score, so now you're in trouble. It's, well, how do we refine things over time, continuously, to try to make them better, or make them fit with our current population, or make them fit with our current view on education, because goodness knows we change perspectives all the time. So we can focus on a problem, so a difference between the present state and a desired state as well. So if we know that we want to implement something like, let's say, project-based or problem-based learning within a classroom, they're different, but they overlap. We can work towards that and see whether it actually has an effect on student growth performance. So we can talk about that model too. But let's get into the nuts and bolts, because it's going to be what you're actually interested in seeing. Okay, so I put some examples on the syllabus. So the example is that I use that are a set of guiding questions for you in selecting a question for your project. Could be something like the following. So does one instructional strategy lead to more student growth than another? And then down in my notes, I've got my little cheat sheet on an example that I can think of from my past. Okay, so let's say that we want to implement two different possible strategies for instruction. Okay, one is, let's go back to the early grades for a second, use an example there. So I'm teaching monetary value of the denominations of money. And so we're talking about values, and understanding values plays to iconic things like dollar bills, nickels, dimes, etc. So we can do that. And we have a secondary outcome, which is understanding and categorizing differences. So fruits versus vegetables. Okay? So we have a teacher who decides to do it two ways. Or we have two teachers who decide to do it in separate ways. Let's do it that way instead. So we have two teachers teaching at the same grade level. One decides, hey, I'm going to take these kids out to the supermarket, and we're going to get a whole bunch of people to come and help us, and it's going to be like a 3-to-1 ratio of supervision to students. And what we're going to do is ask a whole bunch of guiding questions while we're out at the supermarket. They have to get 3 fruits, 3 vegetables, and fit it into this particular budget of money and make change and get the change back from the cashier correctly. And that's how I'll assess whether they actually understood or did not understand the concepts and were able to carry it out. Okay, so that's one way. The other teacher says, no, I'm not doing that. It's too much of a risk. I don't want them out in general population. I'm going to have to recruit a whole bunch of people. Woof. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one or two of my students out. I'm going to film them in the supermarket going through that process. I'm going to edit the video. Then I'm going to come back into the classroom, show the general population. The videos stop at critical periods where questions can be asked, ask them probing questions, and then say, have the students work on a discussion discussing to try to come with those outcomes. How I'm going to assess it in the end is I'm going to take the students and I'm going to make half of them selling stuff. So they're going to bring empty cereal boxes and cans because the food drive's that week anyway. Cans, we're going to label them with prices, and then the sellers are going to label them with prices, and then the people are going to go in, they're going to go shopping, the rest of the group. And then we'll flip-flop that so the other half get to be sellers, the other half to get to be buyers. And I'm going to assess that based on how many fruits and veg or whatever classification of canned fruit, canned veg they come out with, and whether the money was correct on their value of what they calculated it was going to cost them. Okay, two different ways of delivering that instruction. One's clearly anchoring instruction to digital video and classroom simulation. The other one is clearly experiential learning. Okay, so I'm learning through experience by forming that notion out in the field. Okay, so which one's better? Well, the issue is we would then take the students between the two classes and we would compare them on some kind of standardized test measuring that particular curricular outcome or those particular curriculum outcomes and see whether they scored the same. Okay, so that we'd compare scores directly based on the two different models. So in this case, my question is, which model is better? Which model is giving me better growth? Is there a difference in growth for boys and girls depending on the model of instruction that's being used? So I can further drill down on the analysis. Is there a difference on any particular self-identification of race on either of those strategies in terms of outcome? Is there a difference on socioeconomic status and the way that we're employing those outcomes and any betterment in either case, depending on social economic status? So who's on free and reduced lunch versus who's not? Because that's an easy qualifier, right, that we can actually sort kids on. So that's a way of doing that comparison that we're talking about. That's one way. Okay, if I go to the next one, because we've already started talking about race, gender, ability, etc., advantage. So based on gender, race, ability differences, or another variable, is there one group disadvantaged over another group based on teaching style, materials used, assessment, or other variable? So, for instance, if I'm comparing two groups in my class, so we're just going to go girls versus boys, on overall grades in a subject. So I can go back through my individual grade book. I can put the girls' scores in one column and the boys' scores in another column in Excel or Google Sheets, and then I can calculate, or I can match a boy to a girl in each class and see whether there's a discrepancy. So I can calculate whether there's some kind of percentage discrepancy in one group over the other. Or I can do the big scores. So I can calculate scores by assignment, and I can sort them by boys versus girls and see whether one group is outperforming the other in any given subject or any given unit. Okay, that's important strategically as we go through to make sure that there's quality assurance, that we're not being gender biased in teaching, or our materials, which is probably more likely, are not gender biased. Item 3, so how does an analysis of classroom or school performance data reflect or not reflect accurately on your student growth? What needs to be done to change what you find? So I find out that my standardized test scores come back for math, and my female students have outperformed my male students. I go back and do an item analysis on the test, assuming we actually have access to a copy or version of the test or previous versions of the test. I know that's an issue. To identify gender bias. Is there gender bias because of the examples and language being used? So For instance, I can count how many times males being used in the example or a female's being used in the example of problems, word problems, and see whether the frequency is different. If that's the case, that might be an issue. So to retest this, we create more of a general neutral test and see if the performance changes, having done that. So you create your own version of the test, you apply it, and you see whether you come back with different results. What are the quantifiable benefits of collaboration with the professional community? Okay, so imagine my rural school, of which there's not much out there. My rural school has just partnered with the local library to provide computer use, because not all the kids have them at home, in a supervised format in the library for our middle grade students from 3:30 to 7 o'clock at night. Does this access have any impact on the quality of work? So I create a rubric, I assess their work based on a rubric, and let's say I have former work in a file from the previous year, I assess the former work again on that same rubric that I've just created. Is there a quantifiable difference? I might even shuffle them up, I might take the names off of them so I don't know who belongs to what. I might have a panel of people assess them for me that are neutral, that don't know who the work belongs to. Based on that standard rubric and a score that's generated from there, I can assess then whether there's a benefit in that service being open in terms of the quality of work of whatever we're denoting quality is on the particular rubric. Finally, what are the quantifiable benefits of any professional development program? Okay, so imagine my school has themed professional development. So they've decided the theme for this year happens to be project-based assessment and learning. So we've had a bunch of experts come in, tell us how to do it, show us how to do it, and now we're expected to implement it. It's been implemented, or at least we have tried to implement it. So we'll see how well that professional development did. So we can do that in a couple of ways, but the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit for me would be how many projects across the language arts curriculum or across social studies, etc., are actually being done in this format. What makes up this format? So what are we identifying as a criteria that makes up this form of assessment, and how many projects can we actually identify? Okay. Then we can take a look at how many projects there are, if there is a good enough frequency, and correlate those things to student growth on standardized tests, final exams, etc., and compare that to the previous year to see whether or not there's been a performance growth difference in the way that things have been delivered. Okay? So this kind of denotes separation, because we can always drill things down further. So if I've got a class full of students, right, I can do the study within the same group, right? So I could have the group on the left do one form of instruction or one form of project-based learning, and the other half of the group, I can keep it in terms of a standard way that I've always done it. And by comparing those two back and forth, matching one girl to one girl, one boy to one boy, based on, say, ability. So I stack the groups and have a range of ability in both groups, and I match the pairs across the groups. I should be able to calculate whether the performance is actually better given that new condition, so given that new variable, which happens to be, hey, I'm going to do my instruction this way over here, and I'm going to do my instruction this way over here. So we can set up kind of learning centers, keep the other students occupied, teach them this way, keep the other students occupied with the actual carrying out of the work, and teach them the traditional way. And then we can see whether there's actually a measured difference on some kind of standardized test that we do later on. Some kind of, well, again, it has to be something that we know has rigor and we know is actually going to measure something in a very standard way as a summative assessment for those particular outcomes. So what am I suggesting here? Well, number one is we can go with present state, so whatever is currently going on. So if I identify a problem, my boys are failing math. The desired state, boys are passing math, or a percentage score increase of how many are going to do better in math. The objective facts, so here's what I have in terms of results of previous assessments. I know that this particular issue is happening because of this. I know that instruction occurs in this way, right? Consequence, I have this percentage failure rate, or I am not meeting the state benchmark on whatever performance indicator I'm looking for. Relevant and related facts, we can talk about other variables such as male-female ratio. We can talk about SES, socioeconomic status, and the demographics of your classroom that might affect those variables, not having access to computers, etc., if we're doing something that's tech-related. So then we have the problem, like the problems I've just framed out, okay? I'm not going to worry about restating the problem. I actually just want to know what the problem is. All right, so what does it look like in an overview? Okay, so you're going to define the problem for me in your school. So you're going to actively spend this week looking for a problem, okay? You can collaborate with your administrators. You can collaborate with your peers on a problem that you want to focus on. You can collaborate with students if it happens to be, say, a behavioral problem or something like that. You generate as many solutions as possible. Again, it could be alone or it could be with a group. So you're creating yourself your own little think tank with the stakeholders. Then you choose what seems to be the best solution. And then you elaborate and refine to make sure it's an implementable solution. So something that's going to work within the small 3-week frame that you have to implement. You implement the solution and then you evaluate. So there's some kind of assessment to make sure that whatever you implemented had an effect to it. So that's really what the practicum's all about, measuring an effect, giving an implementation. So if I give you an overview of what action research actually looks like, so we're already starting by looking at a problem, right? So we're doing observation to figure out what goes on, the little nuts and bolts, and identifying the issues of what could potentially be there, right? And then we study it. We do some measures, we do some calculations, right? Skip over the publish the research. Go to the intervention, implement the intervention, measure the impact, see whether it has a long-term effect. So we keep going through this cycle, actually until we have something that's publishable. We keep going through this cycle until we actually get to the point that we want. And we might never get to the point that we want if we want just general continuous improvement. So that's what we need to be aware of. Continuous improvement is synonymous with having some kind of quality assurance cycle. You've just created a quality assurance cycle. So that's what we're talking about. So now that you've watched this, now go on to basically selecting and researching what kind of problem you want to focus on. And then we'll hammer out what kind of research design you're going to use in between us, and then you're going to turn in your problem and your design.